Welcome back to History Otherwise, where we explore the paths not taken in history. We love taking a single loose thread in the tapestry of the past and pulling on it just to see what unravels. Today, we are looking at a pivotal moment that could have completely rewritten the map of Europe and, really, the fate of the British Empire. We are talking about the 1798 Irish Rebellion.
It's a fascinating case study. In the history books we know, this was a failed uprising, brutally crushed by British forces, and it led directly to Ireland being absorbed into the United Kingdom. It's often remembered as just a tragedy of disorganized passion against military discipline.
Right, but today we're flipping the script. We are looking at a timeline where the rebellion didn't just survive, it actually succeeded. And to keep things organized for you listening, we're going to structure this deep dive into three main parts. First, we'll look at the military turning point, the literal miracle that made independence possible. Second, we'll unpack the massive geopolitical shockwave that turned the British Empire's secure backyard into, well, a nightmare.
And finally, and this is crucial, we have to look at the cost. We'll explore the tragic internal divisions that plagued this new republic from the very moment of its birth. Because this isn't just a story about a battle won, it's about how the entire architecture of the 19th century world shifts when Britain is forced to exist next door to a hostile revolutionary state.
So let's get right into it, the divergence point. In historical wargaming, you usually look for the single point of failure. Here, it all comes down to the weather, doesn't it?
It does. It's almost a cliche in British history, the Protestant wind, the weather that saved England from the Spanish Armada and, usually blows against invaders. In our timeline, the French sent help to the Irish rebels, but the winds were against them. They arrived too little too late. General Humbert landed a small force in August, months after the main rebellion was already crushed.
But in history, otherwise, the wind blows from the southwest in early June.
Exactly. And that meteorological shift allows a General Jean-Jules Savary to slip a squadron past the Royal Navy blockade. He lands not with a token force, but with 3,000 veteran French soldiers. And crucially, he lands in County Wexford just in time for the Battle of Vinegar Hill on June 21st, 1798.
Okay, let's set the scene there, because Vinegar Hill is legendary in Irish history. In our reality, it was a massacre. General Gerard Lake, the British commander, basically encircled something like 20,000 rebels, mostly armed with pikes, and just shelled them into submission.
Lake was a ruthless commander. He had a total contempt for the rebels. He expected to face a peasant mob. He was known for being aggressive, even reckless, because he just didn't respect his enemy. So on that morning, he orders a direct assault. He thinks he's going to sweep them off the hill with a bayonet charge.
But in this timeline, as he looks up that hill, he's not just seeing farmers with pitchforks. He sees the glint of Charleville muskets and blue-coated French regulars.
And that is the shock of the century. You have to understand the difference in firepower. The Charleville musket was the standard French infantry weapon, reliable, decent range. Suddenly, the British infantry isn't chasing a mob. They're walking into disciplined, rolling volleys of fire.
And the French didn't just bring guns, they brought expertise.
Right. The rebels had captured British cannons, but in our timeline, they didn't really know how to use them effectively. General Varron brings artillery veterans who take over those batteries. So now, General Lake's troops are taking precise, enfilade fire. That's fire coming from the side, cutting through their lines.
I can only imagine the panic. You're expecting a rout, and suddenly you're walking into a kill box.
And then comes the tactical masterstroke. In real history, the rebels were flanked and crushed. Here, General Varron and the rebel leaders, men like Father John Murphy and Anthony Perry, they launched their own counterflank. They hit the side of the British line. Lake's army is overextended, shocked, and they collapse. It's a total rout. They leave behind cannons, wagons, supply trains, everything.
That victory at Vinegar Hill, that's the domino that knocks over the rest. In a rebellion, momentum is everything. The sources describe the news spreading like wildfire.
It changes the psychology of the country. Uprisings in Kildare and Meath, which had been brutally suppressed, suddenly flare up again because now there is hope. And the march on Dublin becomes less of a desperate offensive and more of a national procession.
And the British administration in Dublin Castle?
Panic. Absolute panic. Lord Cornwallis is the Lord Lieutenant, essentially the Viceroy. He realizes he is trapped. You have this Franco-Irish army marching from the south, and simultaneously the United Irishmen sleeper cells inside Dublin rise up. We see sabotage at the castle gates, seizing of armories. It leads to a surrender within days.
And this gives us the cinematic moment of the timeline. In our history, Theobald Wolfe Tone, the father of Irish republicanism, is captured at sea, tried, and dies in prison, a tragic figure.
But here, he sails into a liberated Dublin. Imagine the scene at College Green. You have Wolfe Tone, standing there flanked by French General Varenne and Irish rebel leaders like Bagenal Harvey. He reads the proclamation of the Irish Republic.
It's a Declaration of Independence moment.
It is. He declares a new nation built on the ideals of the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, fraternity. But, this is crucial, declaring a republic is one thing. Surviving your neighbors is another.
Which brings us to our second big focus, the geopolitical shockwave. I think it's easy for us to view this as a local conflict, Ireland versus England, but the sources emphasize that this broke the British strategy for the Napoleonic Wars completely.
You can't overstate this. Britain's entire grand strategy, often called the Blue Water Strategy, relied on being an unassailable island fortress. They used the Royal Navy to blockade France and paid other countries to fight Napoleon on land. But with the fall of Dublin, that fortress has a gaping hole in the western wall.
The texts refer to it as the Irish quagmire.
Right. Suddenly, Britain is fighting a land war in its own archipelago. Think about the Peninsular War, where Britain fought in Spain and Portugal against Napoleon. In this timeline, they're fighting that war a decade early, but they're fighting it in Munster and Connacht. They have to divert thousands of troops and dozens of ships just to contain this new republic.
That has to destroy the political order in London.
It claims its first victim almost immediately, William Pitt the Younger. In our history, he's a titan, one of Britain's greatest prime ministers. Here, he falls from power in disgrace. He's the man who lost Ireland.
And his successor has to do the unthinkable. Let's talk about the Treaty of Amiens in 1802.
In real history, Amiens was a brief pause in the war between Britain and France. In this timeline, it's a humiliation. Lord Cornwallis has to sit across the table from Wolfe Tone, a man the British consider a traitor, and formally recognize the sovereignty of the Irish Republic.
That feels huge. The British Empire, at the height of its arrogance, having to draw a red line down the Irish Sea.
It ends the era of splendid isolation before it even began. Britain becomes paranoid. They turn into Fortress Britain. They can't look outward to empire building in India or Africa with the same confidence because they are constantly looking over their shoulder at the back door.
So we have a victorious republic. Tone has won. The British are kicked out. Roll credits. Happy ending.
Hardly. And this is where the history otherwise perspective gets dark. We have to talk about the internal tragedy. There's a deep irony at the heart of the 1798 rebellion that we really need to unpack.
You're referring to Wolfe Tone's philosophy versus the reality on the ground.
Yes. Tone was a Protestant. His core belief, the manifesto of the United Irishmen, was to substitute the name of Irishman for the distinctions of Protestant, Catholic, and Dissenter. He wanted a secular, united nation.
But the war wasn't won in a debating society. It was won in Wexford.
Exactly. The fighting in Wexford was brutal and, frankly, sectarian. There were atrocities on both sides. When the Republic is declared, the Protestants in the north, the Presbyterians in Ulster, they look south. Now, historically, these Presbyterians were radicals. They were the ones who started the United Irishmen. But now
I see a French-backed Catholic army.
they see a papist puppet of revolutionary France. They see the mob that burned barns in Wexford. So instead of joining the party, Ulster secedes.
This is fascinating. So the partition of Ireland happens 120 years early.
Essentially, the Orange Order, which was just a budding fraternal society, transforms overnight into a full-blown paramilitary force. 9 counties in the north declare loyalty to King George III. They refuse to recognize the Dublin government.
And this puts Wolfe Tone in an impossible position. I see the trap. If he sends his army north to crush them, he proves them right, that this is a war of Catholic oppression against Protestants.
But if he does nothing, the island is partitioned and his republic is incomplete. And that is exactly what happens. You get a permanent, festering border war. It's a civil war that never really ends.
And I assume the British aren't just watching this happen.
Oh, absolutely not. They are pouring gasoline on the fire. This becomes a classic proxy war. The British funnel arms, money, and agents into Belfast through Scottish ports. They realize that if they can keep Ireland fighting itself, it can invade Wales or England.
So the green, white, and orange tricolor, which Tone designed to symbolize peace between the traditions,
Becomes a symbol of mockery. The unity Tone died for in our timeline is the first casualty of his victory in this one. The Republic exists, but it's born broken. It creates a militarized society from day one.
that is a heavy realization. And this instability doesn't just stay in Ireland, it ripples out globally. The outline mentions the empire's Achilles heel. How does having a hostile republic next door change British culture itself?
It makes it much more reactionary. You have to remember, In the early 19th century, Britain had a lot of internal pressure for reform voting rights, worker rights. But here, the government points to Ireland and says, look at that chaos. That's what revolution brings.
So things like the Peterloo Massacre.
We see more repression on a larger scale,
Hmm.
and the four nations dynamic of the UK changes. Scotland becomes hyper-loyal. The Scots see the chaos in Ireland and cling tighter to the Union. But Wales. Wales is interesting
Why Wales?
because of the Celtic connection. The British government becomes terrified of a Celtic contagion. They worry the Welsh will get ideas from the Irish. So they suppress the Welsh language and culture even more brutally than in real history. They try to hammer Wales into an English mold out of fear.
Meanwhile, across the ocean, we have the green Atlantic. This part really caught my eye because it changes American history.
It does. The Irish Republic becomes a rogue state on Britain's flank. It's a safe haven. Indian nationalists, Chartists, radicals, they all flee to Dublin. But the biggest impact is the relationship with the United States.
Because in this timeline, the U.S. and Ireland are natural allies, both republics born of revolution against the British.
Precisely. Irish ports like Cork and Galway become safe harbors for American privateers. Think about the War of 1812. In our history, the British could focus heavily on the U.S. Here, they are distracted. But the real shift is the U.S. Civil War.
Right. In our history, Britain flirted with the idea of supporting the Confederacy to secure cotton.
Here, they can't even think about it. If Britain angers the Union, the U.S. aligns with the Irish Republic, and suddenly Britain is fighting a war on two fronts again. The threat of an Irish-American alliance keeps Britain strictly neutral.
So the special relationship between the U.S. and U.K.
Never happens. Washington views London with suspicion, and Dublin is the wedge between them.
Let's fast forward to the 20th century, World War I. This is the part of the analysis that really scared me. The Germans have a name for Ireland in this timeline.
Irland, das unsinkbare Schlachtschiff. Ireland, the unsinkable battleship. It's a terrifying concept for the British Admiralty.
Because geography is destiny, Ireland sits right across Britain's trade routes.
Exactly. In 1914, instead of Ireland sending volunteers to fight for Britain, the Irish Republic declares neutrality. But it's a hostile neutrality. The western coast of Ireland becomes a haven for German U-boats.
That changes the naval war entirely.
Completely. The Royal Navy can't block the Atlantic because their blockade line is broken. U-boats can refuel in Irish coves, extending their range into the deep Atlantic. And think about 1916. In our history, we had the Easter Rising, a rebellion in Dublin.
Which was small, militarily speaking. A blood sacrifice, they called it.
In this timeline, 1916 isn't a rebellion, it's a massive naval crisis. Britain is nearly starved into submission because they can't protect their merchant ships. They have to keep hundreds of thousands of troops in Ulster and Wales, guarding against a potential German-Irish invasion. That's the Second Western Front.
So the trenches in France might have been less manned because those soldiers were stuck guarding Liverpool and Belfast.
It changes the whole complexion of the Great War. Britain likely survives, but the psychological toll of having an enemy so close for so long leaves the empire shattered much earlier than in our timeline.
It's a grim picture in many ways. A century of paranoia, border wars, and global instability. But, and here's the concluding reflection from our sources, there is one massive, undeniable benefit to this timeline. One thing that might make it all worth it.
Yes, and this is the trade-off that stops you in your tracks. The Great Famine.
The potato blight. In our history, the famine of the 1840s killed 1 million people and forced another million to leave. It decimated the population and left a scar that never healed.
In an independent Irish republic, that famine likely doesn't happen, at least not to that scale. The blight was a biological fact. The fungus would still destroy the potatoes, but the famine was a political failure.
Because the food was there. That's the root that always gets me.
The food was there. In our history, Ireland was exporting grain and livestock to Britain while his people starved. A Dublin government, no matter how poor, no matter how divided or corrupt, would have closed the ports. They would have prioritized feeding their own people.
So we're looking at an Ireland entering the 20th century with a population of maybe 9 or 10 million people.
A densely populated, culturally distinct nation. The language Irish would likely still be the majority tongue, because the famine was what really broke the back of the language in rural areas.
That's the philosophical question we have to leave our listeners with today. Was immediate sovereignty worth the price?
It's the ultimate utilitarian calculus. You get a republic that saves its people from starvation, preserving millions of lives and the culture. But you condemn them to a century of internal conflict, militarization, and proxy wars. You trade the coffin ship for the trench.
In our timeline, Ireland eventually found peace and prosperity, but it took a long, agonizing road to get there. This alternate path offers survival, but at the cost of peace.
It's a reminder that every solution creates its own new set of problems. There are no perfect timelines.
A republic born in victory, but defined by the very division it tried to erase. It really makes you think about how fragile the good outcomes in history actually are. Well, that's all we have time for on this deep dive. Make sure you subscribe for more explorations into the what-ifs of the past, because history might have turned otherwise. Thanks for listening.